of Islamophobia, and then hopefully how to address it within the school community. So the first half of today's session will aim to contextualize Islamophobia. So we look at definitions, we look at the prevalence of Islamophobia, manifestations, so what it actually looks like. And then the second half specifically will equip you with the strategies that you need to actually tackle Islamophobia within the school community. So you can see some of the outputs, some of which, excuse me, I've already covered. So we will start things off by looking at definitions of Islamophobia. We will then move on to look at the ways in which Islamophobia actually manifests and operates, not just in the UK, but hopefully we will touch upon a global perspective as well. We will then look to recognise the severity and the impact of Islamophobia. And then what we will do to finish off the first half of the session is to look at some common causes of Islamophobia and Islamophobic narratives. And as I've already mentioned, second half specifically, we'll look at a pedagogy for tackling Islamophobia, so what we can do to tackle Islamophobia through the curriculum, but hopefully some strategies as well through which we can actually tackle Islamophobia through the hidden curriculum too. So before we actually move on to the definition, just to help you contextualise in demographics, so if we think about the UK Muslim population, so in the UK, according to the recent census, 2021, there are 3.9 million Muslims living in the UK. To be specific, sorry, that is actually England and Wales. And then that covers then 6.5% of the Welsh and the English population. If we think about the top areas within England and Wales that have the largest Muslim populations, you can see that I've listed these on screen. So we've got Birmingham at the top, approximately 341,000, and then we've got the London borough of Newham at number 5 with approximately 122,000. 51% of Muslims in England and Wales are British born, and we know that the Muslim demographic is a young one, with a third of the Muslim population being under the age of 16. If we bring this on a local level, in Wales specifically, there are 66,950 Muslims, which equates to 2.5% of the Welsh population. Muslims in Wales are mostly concentrated in South Wales, and you can see that Cardiff, Newport and Swansea alone account for nearly 80% of Welsh Muslims. Having said that, there are Welsh communities across the country, and you can see I've got an image there as well of a mosque in Haverfordwest, in Milford Haven, sorry, in West Wales. And then again, you can see, similar to the previous slide, I've just summarised then the top areas within Wales which have the largest Muslim population, and at number 4 we've got Wrexham in North Wales at just over 1,500. So we will now move on to look at a definition of Islamophobia. Before I go on to share some of the definitions that I do have that I'd like to share as part of today's session, I'd just like to hand it over to you to share what your understanding of this term is and whether you've come across any definitions. So please feel free to unmute your mics and to share your contributions verbally. Equally, I know for Caroline, your mic isn't working, so please do share your response in the chat. Neil, I don't actually have access to the chat for some reason. Whenever I present in full view, unfortunately I don't have access to the chat, so I will be relying on you to share anything that does come through. But over to you to share your sort of understanding on Islamophobia and whether you've come across any definitions before.
Yeah, thank you very much. I can't see anything in the chat at the moment. Is there anybody in the call who wants to come in? I suppose from my perspective, it's the discrimination against anybody. It's you know, kind of the simplest way of putting it, discrimination against Muslims, and obviously that kind of, whether that's in from kind of comments or from sort of persecution as well. So kind of from that perspective, it's the simplest form, I would say.
Thank you.
Anybody else would like to come in? Or comment in the chat?
I had the same as you, Neil, like
Yeah.
a discrimination and prejudice directed at Muslims.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you ever so much for starting us off both. So yeah, you're absolutely right. An element of Islamophobia is most definitely centered around obviously discrimination. I'm thinking about prejudice as well. So if we think about Islamophobia on that sort of interpersonal and internalized level, it does most definitely manifest
Mm.
through prejudice. And you can see that I've summarized a graphic, or I have a graphic, sorry, on screen, which obviously highlights the way in which racism exists within society. And there's a reason for that, and I'll go on to explain why. So here we have a definition of Islamophobia, which was put forward by the All Party Parliamentary Group on British Muslims in 2018. The APPG on British Muslims is a cross party parliamentary group which sits in Westminster to raise the positive contributions of Muslims within society, but then also highlighting the discrimination and obviously the Islamophobia that is faced by British Muslims here in the UK. And in 2018, they put together this definition of Islamophobia in their report, Islamophobia Defined. And this states then that Islamophobia is rooted in racism, and it is a type of racism that targets expressions of Muslimness or perceived Muslimness. So in terms of this definition, if we break it down, we can break it down into two parts. The first part is pretty self explanatory in the sense that it conceptualizes Islamophobia as a form of racism. So, whenever we think about Islamophobia and the way in which it operates and manifests, it is very similar to other forms of racism in society. And then the second half then goes on to explain that it targets expressions of Muslimness or perceived Muslimness. And what that essentially means is that you can actually be affected, or you could be a victim of Islamophobia, and you may not necessarily be a Muslim. And we have seen that time and time again with members of the Jewish community, members of the Hindu community, even the Sikh community, where certain religious identity markers, that could be dress, that could be headwear, or particular symbols, which are often confused or sometimes conflated. Um, and for that reason, then particular individuals who perceive a particular individual to be a Muslim, when in reality they're not. But under this definition, if someone is targeted because of a particular identity marker and the perpetrator perceives that individual to be a Muslim, then under this definition, that would constitute Islamophobia. So, two key takeaways: Islamophobia is rooted in racism, and you can actually be a victim of Islamophobia without actually being a Muslim. And it's for that reason why I had the graphic on the previous slide here on the levels on which racism exists, to really help us think about the way in which Islamophobia actually manifests and operates in society. And we now know that that is very similar or akin to other forms of racism. And we'll explore this idea in a lot more detail. But just to kind of expand upon this definition that you can see, because there is a lot of debate, and you may be aware of this as well, on the debates around defining Islamophobia, and in particular the definition that we can see on screen. There are various organisations, individuals who have argued then that the definition that we've just explored is quite broad, and it's open to interpretation. And for that reason, the Coalition Against Islamophobia has put together these guidelines that you can see, which should be used in conjunction with the definition that we have explored, because the All Party Parliamentary Group definition is a definition which has been widely accepted by a lot of political parties, including Plaid, the SNP, Labour when they were in opposition, but since they have come into government, they have actually dropped the definition. But nevertheless, the definition itself, it has been adopted by various other organisations, institutions, trade unions, teaching unions, universities, and even local authorities across the UK. And if I'm not mistaken, Bridgend Council has also adopted this definition that we have just explored. But then going to the back to the point that I mentioned around the definition being quite broad, that is why the Coalition Against Islamophobia has put together the guidelines that you can see on screen. And then these state then that, taking into account that Islamophobia is demonstrated in and articulated through speech, writing, behaviours, structures, policies, legislation, or activities that work to control, regulate, or exclude Muslim participation within social, civic, economic, and political life, or which may embody hatred, vilification, stereotyping, abuse, discrimination, or violence that is directed at Muslims. So hopefully these guidelines, they give us more of a holistic understanding of what Islamophobia actually is, how it manifests, and the impact that it has. So we can see that it's not only demonstrated or articulated through speech, writing, behaviours, but then also through policies and legislation. And that is quite often the spheres in which are often overlooked, and people fail to recognise that the issue is actually a lot more structural, and widely embedded across society. And you can see again, the impact that this has, and the other sort of spheres in which it operates. So that could be social, civic, economic, and even political life. And again, through stereotyping, abuse, discrimination, which we've touched upon, and even violence. So as I mentioned, hopefully these guidelines give us more of a holistic understanding of what Islamophobia actually is and how it manifests. Equally, there are various other definitions as well, on Islamophobia. Another one which I've summarised on screen, and this one has been put together by the Runnymede Trust, which is a think tank based here in the UK, and again quite similar to the All Party Parliamentary Group, a sort of simple or a basic definition on the way in which they have conceptualised Islamophobia is that it's anti-Muslim racism. Then they've also provided a longer definition, which again has huge overlaps with the guidelines that I have just shared. So again, you can see, that the impact that it has and the various spheres in which it operates, and that includes political, economic, social, cultural, or any other field of public life. So I guess the key takeaway here is that Islamophobia does not just operate through verbal and physical attacks. It operates on a much wider and deeper, and a structural level. So at this point, you may actually be thinking, why has Islamophobia been conceptualized as a form of racism when Muslims do not actually constitute a race? At the very basic level, the answer to that would be that Islamophobia is not merely a hate crime, and we've explored that through the two definitions that I presented. But then equally, our understanding of racism has changed over time. So we know that there is no such thing as race. Race itself is a social construct. So when we are speaking about racism or race, it is from a sociological perspective. And again, we will go on to explore this idea of, racialization in a few moments' time. But again, I just really want to highlight, some contributions from major think tanks and organisations here in the UK, which again very much advocate for conceptualising Islamophobia as a form of racism as opposed to a hate crime. So again, if we go back to the Runnymede Trust, they have argued then that a definition of Islamophobia cannot and should not focus on hate crime, and that is because the Islamophobic discrimination faced by people is much deeper and widespread than just your verbal and physical attacks, which amount to a hate crime. And then equally then, we've got the Muslim Council of Britain, which is the umbrella body for all Muslim organisations here in the UK, who have argued then that Islamophobia manifests in the same way as other forms of racism. And again, touching upon the various spheres that we've, highlighted, that could be employment, the criminal justice system, politics and media, and the way in which it actually operates. So that could be through stereotypes, prejudice, verbal and physical abuse, and even through discrimination. So if we think about this idea of racialization, we know that Muslims as a group have actually become racialized. So that is when we apply racial character to a particular group in society. And we've got various academics again who have contributed to this particular sort of, debate, or this sort of point that Islamophobia should actually be conceptualized as a form of racism. So we've got Salod here, who has argued that racialization is the process by which bodies actually become racial, in their lived realities because of biological or even cultural traits. Equally, Professor Madood then, in a paper that I've, screenshotted on screen, has argued then that Islamophobia should actually be understood as a form of cultural racism, because while the perception and treatment of Muslims, has a religious, and a cultural dimension, equally it actually bears a physical appearance or, an ancestral component. So really, really important to realise and acknowledge, that obviously the discrimination and the way in which Muslims actually experience racism, Islamophobia, sorry, is akin to other forms of racism. And again, to really help us visualize and to really sort of bring what quite often is an abstract idea to life, I've got this analogy of an iceberg. So if we think about Islamophobia as an iceberg, at the very top, we have got verbal and physical attacks, which amount to hate crime. And these are very visible for individuals to recognise and to notice. But when we unravel beneath the surface, we can see then that Islamophobia also manifests through discrimination, marginalisation, stereotypes, and even exclusion. And quite often, these are the manifestations of Islamophobia which go unnoticed and which are quite often difficult to observe. So, again, really, really important to realise, obviously, that at the tip of the iceberg, we've got verbal and physical attacks. But then Muslims and those perceived to be Muslims also experience discrimination, marginalisation, stereotypes, and exclusion. So that leads us very nicely then to manifestations of Islamophobia. So this isn't an exhaustive list. I've got various sort of examples of Islamophobia which we have seen in everyday sort of scenarios, and these are extracts which I have got directly from a report which was put together by the Muslim Council of Britain, as I've already highlighted, the umbrella body for all Muslim organisations here in the UK. So we've got then causing calling for aiding or even justifying the killing of Muslims because of their religious identity, objectifying and generalising Muslims as being different, exotic, or underdeveloped, and equally implying that they are outside of or even distinct and even incompatible with British society and identity, charging Muslims with conspiring to harm humanity, and even then blaming Muslims for the economic and social ills of society, making dehumanizing, vilifying, demonizing, or even stereotypical allegations about Muslims. We've got a really interesting one here around double standards. And we've got an example of loyalty tests, which may seem quite bizarre in practice, but these tests, they do exist. There was one in 2015, and there's been multiple ones ever since. But I'll focus on the one in 2015, which was a BBC poll conducted in 2015, which actually found that 95% of British Muslims felt loyal towards Britain, and 93% believed that they should obey British laws. And even though obviously the outcomes of this particular poll are incredibly positive, what the general public quite often fail to acknowledge and understand is that by singling out a particular group with questions concerning their loyalty and patriotism is not only discriminatory and Islamophobic, but what it does, particularly for the Muslim community then, is that it decreases the confidence in identity, and which can then lead to alienation and disenfranchisement from British society. So quite a bizarre concept, but they do exist, and various ones that I've seen ever since. A very recent one actually, I think, which was published earlier this year. I don't have it in this particular session, but what I will most definitely make sure to do is that I will signpost you to a reading list which you can take a look at later on. And then finally, we've got accusing Muslims as a collective for being responsible for real or imagined wrongdoings which may be committed by a single Muslim person, group, or a nation, or even for acts which have been committed by non-Muslims. And again, we see this time and time again within the media when a particular attack or an incident which may happen to be perpetrated by a Muslim, immediately their identity then is associated, and it is seen as a factor or a reason as to why then that individual has actually perpetrated a particular crime. And then what we often see then is that the Muslim community as a whole, be that on a local or an international level, is asked to condemn those attacks, but we don't see that with any other particular groups or individuals within society. So we are now going to move on to the history of Islamophobia, and we will very briefly touch upon this. But if we think about the term Islamophobia itself, it can actually be traced back all the way to the earliest 20th century in a French article in 1925. Quite often there is this misconception that Islamophobia is a post 9/11 phenomenon. and we see and we hear a lot of that. However, we can see here that the term itself, as I've already mentioned, came about in the early 20th century, and here in the UK specifically, the landmark report by the Runnymede Trust in 1997 highlighted then that Islamophobia is a challenge for us all. Fast forward 20 years, the Runnymede Trust actually published a 20-year anniversary report which was titled Islamophobia, Still a Challenge for Us All, and that found then that Islamophobia as a phenomenon has become a lot more complex and a lot more entrenched within society. But again, just to emphasise, even within the UK, this was an issue way before 9/11. And I've got a graphic here again which really highlights and summarises the various spheres in which Islamophobia operates, and something which the Runnymede Trust actually highlighted back in 1997. So you can see that Muslims are excluded from employment, discriminated against in the provision of health and education services, and are victims of prejudice in the media and everyday conversations. So then if we think back to the history of Islamophobia, we know for centuries Muslims have actually been demonized, and they have been portrayed as the primitive other. If we think all the way back to the Middle Ages and the 11th century Crusades, the Catholic Pope actually referred to Muslims as actually being an alien race. Who were capable of great brutality, and this actually proves then that European Christians or within the medieval times actually had a racial attitude towards Muslims, and this was centered around obviously their culture and their religion as being different. So we can see various academics again who have written about this, and we've got a recent paper here in 2021 which states then that the bigotry towards Islam and the hatred against Muslims and prejudices about their cultural inferiority actually lurk deep in the history of European colonialism and holy wars. And a really, really interesting point that they make here is that it's actually possible to speak of several phases and contexts around Islamophobia within Europe, but in the end, it actually constitutes a perpetual living phenomenon. And again, we've got another paper here, which again highlights the way in which Islamophobia has actually evolved. This particular theorist, Sunnah, has argued then that Islam always represents the closest other and the most active enemy for the West. And they focused then their paper around otherizing, and they've used the example of Donald Trump, specifically in 2016, and his presidential campaign, and how we actually came into power with an Islamophobic campaign. And you will probably be familiar as well with the infamous ban, the Muslim ban, which called then for a total and complete ban on all Muslims actually entering the US. And this was obviously a key sort of delivery or a campaign sort of delivery for Donald Trump, which eventually then they went on to implement as the travel ban, which was then to ban particular Muslims from particular countries from entering the US. So again, we've got an example then of Islamophobia operating on a state or a structural or a state-sponsored level. Really interestingly then, again, which really links then to the history of Islamophobia, is this idea of the Islamophobia industry or the Islamophobia network. And this is actually a funded network, believe it or not, that systematically spreads fear and hatred of Muslims. It is an organised network in the West, which operates then through networks of politicians, think tanks, scholars, religious groups, bloggers and pundits and even activists. And what they aim to do then is they aim to work alongside each other to negatively influence public opinion and government policy and to spread fear and misinformation around Islam and Muslims. And you can see the wealth of money which has actually been poured into these groups. It is actually astonishing, and this is quite often something that people fail to realise or are completely unaware of. So you can see that over $105 million, so in the US specifically, were actually poured into 26 Islamophobia network groups between 2017 and 2019 to spread misinformation and conspiracy theories about Islam and Muslims. And interestingly, there's also a reference which goes all the way back to 2013. So again, this isn't a recent thing. We can see how this has actually been operating for time. But what is happening now is that individuals such as Nathan Lean Chapman are actually identifying and writing about this. And if you would like to learn more about this, I have highlighted Nathan Lean Chapman's text, who writes about the Islamophobia industry. So if you are interested in learning more about this, please do take a look at this text. So again, this really highlights then that Islamophobia is not just an individual act of prejudice, is actually structural, and it's supported by institutions such as the media, politics, and funding bodies as well, and not just within the US, on a global level. So we are now going to focus then on the prevalence of Islamophobia, and thinking about how common it actually is within the UK. So I've got a few articles which I have screenshotted on screen, which really highlight, obviously, in the worst case scenario, sadly, Islamophobia does actually lead to the loss of lives. So we've got various examples, some of which you may be familiar with. So we've got the Finsbury Park attack incident, which was actually perpetrated by a Welsh individual, Darren Osborne, and you can see the van that he hired from Pontyclun with the intent to actually cause harm to the Muslim community. And he was successful, sadly. Makram Ali lost his life as a result of this tragic incident, and various others also sustained serious and life-changing injuries. We've got the infamous Punish a Muslim Day letters, which was circulating across the UK. And then we've also got the example of Mohsin Ahmad, an innocent 80-year-old grandfather in Rotherham, who was making his way to early morning prayers, who was approached by a group of men and was attacked because of his Muslim identity, and sadly because of the injuries that he sustained. Days later in hospital, he sadly lost his life. So in the worst case scenario, we see Islamophobia taking lives of individuals, not just here in the UK, but also from a sort of global perspective as well. And you'll all be familiar with the Christchurch attacks in New Zealand, which took place, if I'm not mistaken, in 2019, where an individual stormed into a mosque and killed 54, if I'm not mistaken, Muslims on Friday during Friday prayers in New Zealand in Christchurch. So I've got some statistics here that I'd like to share, which will again help us to really understand how common and how prevalent Islamophobia is, and in various spheres of public life. So we'll start off with interpersonal. So if we think about hate crimes specifically, in England and Wales between 2017 and 2025, the percentage of religious hate crimes that were targeted against Muslims ranged between 45 and 52%. Home Office statistics, hate crime statistics for the year end in 2025 came out last month, and they actually highlighted a 19% increase in Islamophobic incidents between 2024 and 2025. We've got a statistic then from the Islamophobia Response Unit, which is an independent charity which monitors, which has, a reporting branch for Islamophobic incidents, but then also offers victims of Islamophobia support. And they found then that between 2023 and 2024, there was actually a staggering 763% of increase of Islamophobia between 2023 and 2024. And in Scotland, again, this is a UK-wide issue, 75% of Muslims say that Islamophobia is a regular or everyday issue in Scottish society, which is quite interesting because quite often Wales and Scotland are seen as a bit more progressive than England. And in particular in Scotland, there is this myth of Scottish exceptionalism where Islamophobia doesn't actually exist. But again, we can see various examples and various obviously statistics which completely refute this idea and this misconception. We've also got internalised Islamophobia. So 53% of Britons feel that Islam is not compatible with British values. And again, if we go back to the manifestations of Islamophobia that we explored, again, this would be a very recent example from 2025, which highlights then that manifestation of Islamophobia. We've also then got the British public is almost 3 times more likely to hold prejudiced views of Islam than they are of any other religions. From the same paper, we found then that 25.9% of British public feel negative towards Muslims and 9.9% feeling very negative. And then we've got 47% of British people wrongly believing that there are Muslim no-go areas in the UK which are governed by Sharia law. Completely false assumption, but you can see how misconceptions are very rife and widespread across the UK. And then finally, we've got then Islamophobia specifically within employment. So we've got 1 in 3 Brits have witnessed anti-Muslim behaviour in the workplace or the place of study. 69% of Muslims have actually experienced Islamophobia in the workplace. And really interestingly, there was a 2017 survey which actually found that a candidate with an English sounding name was actually 3 times more likely to be offered a job than an applicant with a Muslim sounding name. So there were 2 individuals, one by the name Muhammad and the other who went by the name of Adam. They submitted near enough identical CVs in terms of their background, experience, employment history. And what this particular survey found then was that Adam was actually 3 times more likely to be offered a job interview, and that was purely down to the differences in the name. We've also then got the 19.8% of Muslims are in full-time employment compared to 34.9% for the overall population. And a really, really important point here from Samir, who argues then that the Muslim penalty in employment cannot be explained by their so-called socio-cultural attitudes. And again, quite often there is a misconception that the reason why we have these statistics that you can see on screen and the reason why there is a gap is because Muslims are failing to integrate. But again, complete misconception, and we can see that the issue at stake here is very structural, and it is a very widespread and it is entrenched within British society. Finally, what we're going to do is just touch upon in terms of statistics and prevalence on a global perspective before we go on to sort of reflect on your own sort of reflections on what we have just seen. So Islamophobia, according to the United Nations right expert in 2021, Ahmed Shahid, stated then has actually reached epidemic proportions, and that is on a global level. In Canada, we've got 51% of Canadians support government surveillance of mosques. In India, and again, part of the world which quite often there is a misconception that perhaps Islamophobia doesn't necessarily exist. We've got an example then of state-sponsored Islamophobia through the Citizenship Amendment Act, which completely excluded reference to the Muslim community. And then Amnesty International then, in their regional overview of Islamophobia in Europe, actually documents then that the UK, including European states, including the UK, have actually racialised the Muslim religious minority and has subjected them to a range of discriminatory and racist laws, policies and practices. So before we go on to sort of move on to the school context and sharing some statistics on how prevalent Islamophobia is within schools, just want to pause and ask for your own sort of reflections on what we have just seen. Is there anything that's particularly surprised you? Is there anything new that has sort of come around or something new that you've learnt? It's just an opportunity for you to sort of share anything that may have particularly surprised you at this point. It doesn't necessarily have to be on the statistics. It could be anything else that we've covered. And if you've got any questions as well, equally, please do ask these away now.
Thank you, Bisma. I think it's kind of startling is the word which brings to mind when kind of you hear those statistics and read them, and a bit naive of me to think that you read the news and think that I suppose we should being in at the end of 2025, living in a world that's much more inclusive and just hard to believe that kind of the people out there kind of obviously carry out these acts, etc. And the one for me, kind of the increase in Islamophobic incidents, the 19% increase this year, and I think thinking back on it when I reflect, maybe it's not as surprising kind of how strong social media is these days and how much of an impact that's potentially had on Islamophobia and other forms of discrimination as well. obviously you mentioned Donald Trump there and kind of the influence that kind of personality has on people as well.
Absolutely.
It's frightening. It's very frightening, I think, and having a 7-year old growing up in this world, that's something which does kind of alarm me in going forward. And hopefully kind of, we are in a very strong position within schools to help to change that as well. And obviously I know your next part's on the education aspect of it, but
Absolutely, yeah.
that's something which kind of stands out. And it'd be interesting to know kind of, obviously this is from a statistical point of view, is when is that increase started to happen, kind of that peak, I suppose. We think about obviously the terrible impact of 9/11 and what happened then, and the increase in Islamophobia then. Did it start to come down, or has it always been on that trajectory of going up?
It's an
That's kind of
interesting
some.
point that you make, yeah, there, Neil. So, in terms of Home Office statistics specifically, so we can see that the Home Office started recording religious hate crimes which targeted against Muslims from 2017. So, in terms of that data
Right.
set, we've got obviously the data there which highlights then, if I'm not mistaken, it starts been fluctuating. So, it's ranged between 38 to 45%. But we do know that obviously events, be that on a local or an international level, to result obviously in a surge. And quite often when we see that increase, particularly the 19%, it is a reflection of that, especially this year and
Mm,
last year, is because of obviously the race riots that we saw last year.
yeah.
And again, if you take a look at the data and the statistics, I'm pretty sure that there will be reference to that. But equally on an international level as well, we know that events on a global level affect what is happening here. But then equally, Neil, as you mentioned, and as you alluded, obviously, to the role of public figures and social media, something that we will cover, has a huge bearing as well on the statistics that we see. But in terms of the recent spike, it is most definitely as a result of those race riots that we saw,
Yeah.
which were happening obviously up and down the country last year. But thank you ever
Mm.
so much, Neil, for your reflections. Is there anything else? Anything else that anyone else wants to sort of share or reflect upon at this point before we move on to schools specifically?
There's
Anything in the chat, Neil?
nothing in the chat at the
Okay,
moment.
so we'll move on then. Equally, if there
Thank
is
you.
anything that comes to mind, please feel free to stop me as we are going along. So, thinking about then schools specifically, and whether or not schools should actually be concerned about Islamophobia. Now, again, quite often schools are viewed as engines for social justice, and spheres in which perhaps Islamophobia does not necessarily operate, or spheres in which perhaps Islamophobia is sort of exempt. But we can see here again from just various different extracts from newspaper headlines that that is not the case. Islamophobia, again, it does operate within schools on various different levels, not just through the verbal and physical attacks, but on a wider structural level. And equally, it's not just student to student bullying. Quite often, what we're seeing is staff to student, student to staff, but then institutionally as well through policies and other structures within schools. So we will explore this in a bit more detail. So we've got a report from the Social Mobility Commission in 2017, which highlighted then that Muslims experience the greatest economic disadvantages of any group in UK society. And then this tracks then how this impacts young Muslims through various stages and phases of their lives. So in education specifically, from the same report, we have then that young Muslims feel that teachers have either a stereotypical or overly low expectations of young Muslims. And equally, there are insufficient Muslims and teachers or other role models in schools, and non Muslim teachers are often reluctant to engage with them. Equally, this goes on to higher education. So, incidences of Islamophobia or racism, or even failure to recognise the Muslim identity, then results then in obviously young Muslims and the way in which it impacts their self esteem and their confidence. Equally, we've got various other statistics that we'll explore here. A very recent study then by University College London found then that up to 3/4 of school students actually displayed Islamophobic and misogynistic opinions within the classroom. So again, really, really worrying picture that we can see. If we break this down into the respective home nations, we've got in England a 2015 survey by Show Racism the Red Card found that over a third of surveyed children agreed with the statement that Muslims are taking over England. In Scotland, we've got then that 55% of high school respondents said that they had encountered verbal Islamophobia, and 53% of primary schools had also encountered verbal Islamophobia. In Wales specifically, the former Children's Commissioner for Wales, Sally Holland, back in 2018 had actually identified Islamophobia as an issue for young Muslims. So you can see here an extract from a BBC report, which she said then that she's spoken to young Muslims across Wales who have told her that they're often scared in their communities and that they directly experience abuse at school and that they're tired of the way in which Islam is often portrayed in the media and the effect that this has on the views of their non-Muslim peers. So as obviously Neil has mentioned, education is obviously an incredibly powerful tool through which we can combat Islamophobia, and as educators, obviously, we are essentially at the front line of countering prejudice, hate, irrespective obviously who may be at the receiving end of that. And as we've already mentioned, obviously the second half of this particular session will focus on that specifically. But again, hopefully this really emphasises that our schools are not exempt, and educators really need to be mindful that Islamophobia operates in various different spheres within obviously public life, and what we often see on a societal level trickles its way down into school communities. So we are now going to focus on the causes of Islamophobia, some of which we would have already touched upon as part of some of the reflections that we've had, and just some of the points that I have already addressed. But over to you again to kind of share what your thoughts are on some of the causes of Islamophobia. So before I go on to sort of highlight and summarise the main causes of Islamophobia, what or who do you think then is responsible perhaps for the surge that we have seen recently, or just generally across the board, be that on a national or an international level? Where do you think then Islamophobia takes root, and what are some of the causes of Islamophobia, be that here in the UK or on an international level? So over to you.
Oh, yeah, we've got a hand there. Fab, coming in.
I think from a perspective of being in school, a lot of the places we're seeing these viewpoints come from is home. It's that family influence, and maybe then they're influenced more by social media, things like new political administrations coming into power. But I think families are presenting this terminology at home. Learners are coming into school. They have absolutely no understanding of how what they're saying is hateful and wrong. And then from our perspective, we log it, try and give them intervention, and then the parents almost argue back that we're not allowed to do that kind of intervention. So I definitely think parents, family have a really big role to play.
You're absolutely right, Amelia. And again, this is something that I've heard with my sort of conversations from Welsh educators specifically. So as I mentioned, obviously we're running our project here in South Wales, through which we're delivering workshops to children, young people, as well as the professional learning sessions for adults. And from my conversations with the educators, is that especially in those areas which may not necessarily be diverse, is that the root sort of issue is most definitely from the home sort of environment and the terminology, and quite often school children and children, sorry, specifically, they actually fail to realise some of the terminology that they're actually using is actually a racist slur. So if we think about the P word, and again from the sort of sessions that I've delivered, it was actually quite astonishing to see how many children and young people who didn't actually realise that that term, the P term, is actually a racist slur, and that is because it is being used so casually within the sort of home environment. So you're absolutely right in saying it's particularly for those sort of communities which may not necessarily be diverse, and for our youngest of learners, quite often it is the home environment. So thank you ever so much for sharing that insight.
Just to share from the chat as well, Biz, making if you talk about kind of the use of the B term there, and not knowing, and Caroline and Nicola have both said about misconceptions, and about social media, the impact. We've mentioned that previously, but I think I agree, both of those really strong influences on Islamophobia, and kind of having that, creating that kind of narrative around it as well. And you know, you talk about kind of the impact that has as well of kind of using terms um, which people don't necessarily think, you know, is a racial or discriminative term. But even as well, I've spoken to some schools where the victim then hasn't kind of reacted to it because it's
Absolutely.
become the norm. It's become the
Mm-hmm.
norm, and then they like, well, yeah, it's what I expect to happen. And actually, to the extent where the victim didn't realize then, in terms of, and I'm not saying it was an Islamophobic comment, but it was certainly a racially motivated comment where the victim didn't actually realize that what was happening was that they were being discriminated against.
Absolutely, and I've
Um,
witnessed this firsthand myself. So when I was training to teach, and that is obviously within Wales, there was one particular student who, when we were studying Jack the Ripper, who said, "Oh, no offense to you, miss, but Jack the Ripper actually looks like the P word." And again, completely, I guess, innocent in some respect from that particular student, perhaps didn't realise obviously the ramifications and the impact
mm,
of his words. But because, like you said, Neil, it's become so normalised, and in
yeah,
particular, because there is inaction in part of perhaps individuals who may think that what's the point in actually reporting, but equally because it's become so normalised, we see obviously these particular slurs and these particular terminology just being used as part of daily, everyday sort of conversations. So it is incredibly worrying, and we
mm,
are seeing it within schools as well. An example of which I've obviously just shared with you.
yeah,
So thank you ever so much for those reflections. And again, we will touch upon some of what we have just sort of addressed here, in particular social media and the media itself. We've also then got the role of public figures, lack of legislative protection and structural barriers. For the interest of time, we'll focus on the first two, so media negativity and the role of public figures. But just so that you're aware on a wider level as well, we do have then lack of legislative protection, which results then in Islamophobia playing out in everyday sort of spheres and every day-to-day life, but then also structural barriers as well. And you can see a really powerful quote here from Shafa, who states then that educators should understand Islamophobia as both a type of bullying and a consequence of bias and of misinformation that is actually perpetuated by the media, public figures, and local community members. And we will explore this in a bit more detail. So, if we think about media negativity specifically, so here then we've got various statistics and extracts from reports. A very recent one from the Centre for Media Monitoring. So GB News then repeatedly frame Muslims as perpetrators rather than victims of violence, and downplaying some of the recent attacks that we've seen up and down the country on mosques and Muslim communities, which then resulted in a biased narrative. Islamic Relief then found that 45% of Muslims actually avoid news channels or reading newspapers due to persistent negative stereotypes and prejudice against Muslims. Another report from the Centre for Media Monitoring in 2018 found that actually 59% of all articles here in the UK associate Muslims with negative behaviours. And then we've also then got this idea of imagery and then also how this applies to Hollywood. So the media creates images of Islam and Muslims as the other, and they're described as extremely violent, sexist, militant, and undemocratic. And if we think about Hollywood, and quite often, obviously, where our children, young people, and our students actually gain a lot of their knowledge and understanding and information around Islam and Muslims from, we can see here that Uzma and others have stated that Hollywood has actually contributed immensely to the institutionalization of prejudice against Muslims, and that was actually way before 9/11. So, again, really, really mindful, really, really important that educators are mindful of obviously the root causes. And some of the narratives as well that we will go on to explore, and how we can actually combat these then within our classrooms. So, what we are now going to do is we're just going to pause and to reflect upon some of the articles, the headline story specifically that we can see on screen. I'll move on to the next slide because it is a slightly more zoomed in version. just an opportunity for you to pause and to reflect and to unpack some of the narratives and perhaps think about if there have been any sort of examples within schools which may relate to some of the headlines that you can see. But just generally, what are your honest thoughts and your reactions to these headlines? Is there anything in particular that surprises you? And equally, what are some of the narratives that we can unpack from these headlines? So over to you.
Unfortunately, I think it doesn't surprise me. Sorry, Amelia just jumped in there. It doesn't surprise me. It's very aggressive in the terms of the terminology that's being used in many of the articles. Um, yeah, I mean, from a school perspective, we're bringing Amelia here.
Yeah, something I found, and we use kind of articles like this when we do lessons on Islamophobia, is and we talk about a lot the use of the word jihad, and in articles, if you type that into Google Images, it has no real understanding in the British media of what the word jihad actually means. And I think just through these, I can see the word jihad multiple times just in these pictures. And again, it's just that those stereotypes and just, well, I would argue ignorance of what the teachings actually are and what they mean.
Absolutely, yeah. Particular sort of words as you've and concepts as you mentioned, Amelia, used to essentially weaponize and to sensationalize and to cause fear and panic. And when we think about the term that you just mentioned, um, we hear it in the sort of everyday conversations as well, and huge misconceptions which have been tied around this particular term or this particular concept within obviously the religion of Islam, which has absolutely nothing to do with what we are actually seeing within the media. And again, if we just relate that back to everyday conversations, where do individuals or even our youngsters gain these sort of ideas from? It's precisely from what you can see on screen and these sort of misconceptions and narratives around that. So yeah, thank you so much, and it's great to hear actually that you are actually using these headlines and these articles to kind of instill, I guess, media literacy amongst your students. And this is something that we do as well as an organisation. So we deliver workshops around common misconceptions and stereotypes around Islam and Muslims. And we share similar images that you can see on screen. It's just an opportunity for students to kind of think about where they may have seen these before, some of the terminology. And again, so often that we hear our children, young people who mention a lot of these terminology, and they say that they're surprised to hear that it actually has nothing to do with what the religion actually preaches itself. So thank you so much for sharing that insight, Amelia. Is there anything else that's come through the chat, Neil?
Caroline just kind of to re-emphasize the points there. She said negative portrayal in the media. I think kind of that's some how negative the negativity is that's coming through, and yeah, jihad is often misunderstood.
Absolutely, yeah, and these are very deliberate attempts to obviously other Islam and Muslims, and the majority of these are simply untrue, and a lot of the times, and the infamous one that I always point to is the 1 in 5 Brit Muslim sympathy for jihadis. The son was actually forced to retract and to apologise for this particular headline, which was completely untrue. But again, when that is often done, obviously the damage is more or less done. And when those apologies are offered, there are several pages obviously into the actual newspapers themselves, and as I mentioned, the damage is already done. Just want to flag as well at this point that a lot of obviously what we're seeing here are tabloid right-wing sort of newspapers, but the article, the statistics that I shared on this screen, they cover both your broadsheet and your tabloid newspapers. So something to be mindful of there. This is something that students actually pick up on as well, that these aren't necessarily newspapers that we would refer to because they are tabloid newspapers. But just to really flag is that the statistics that we've covered, they cover both your broadsheet and your tabloid newspapers. And equally, what we're seeing also, we can see it on social media as well. So here, I've actually extracted these just over a week ago, I believe. I've actually come off from X myself, but then I went on there earlier this month. just to see what some of the conversations around Islamophobia Awareness Month are like and who's engaging in the campaign. And sadly, I came across this particular tweet by Dawn Butler, who was actually promoting and raising awareness of Islamophobia Awareness Month and how she shows her solidarity with the Muslim community. But you can see a wave of Islamophobic comments which have come underneath, obviously, the tweet from the MP Dawn Butler. Really, really concerning. Really, really, obviously, divisive in terms of the terminology that we can see, and a lot of it is rooted in those misconceptions and those narratives that we will explore in a few moments' time. But again, obviously, even though quite often what I do hear as well is that obviously children, young people may not necessarily gain their sources of information from newspapers. Obviously, increasingly, children, young people, they will have access to other sort of mediums, and we can see it is equally as obviously destructive on social media as it is in print media. And I've got an example as well here of a broadsheet newspaper. So obviously I've mentioned that what the statistics that we have covered cover both your broadsheet and your tabloid newspapers. And we've got an example here of the Times. There was actually an investigation which went into this. I've highlighted it on the left-hand side. You can see by the Media Reform Coalition. And they actually found then that the Times repeatedly failed to do basic fact-checking and a number of stories targeted Muslims, routinely omitted essential context, and essentially what that resulted then was, or what we saw as a result of that was a surge in Islamophobic incidents on the streets of Britain. We've also got the role of public figures, which we can't escape, sadly. So we've got a extract on the right hand side from an Islamic Relief report which found then that 53% of Muslims have said that political leaders are making them feel less welcome in the UK. And sadly, I've got some quotes from politicians here in the UK themselves. This isn't to discredit any particular political party. I'm not here to advocate, obviously, any particular political party, but you can see that the quotes that I have on screen, they come from a range of political parties, not just necessarily those which may lean on the right-hand side of the political spectrum. So 2018, when Boris Johnson was actually serving as Prime Minister, he actually compared Muslim women who observe the veil or the niqab as bank robbers and letterboxes. And what we saw as a result of that was a huge surge in Islamophobic incidents against Muslim women. If I'm not mistaken, following this particular remark, there was a 350% increase in Islamophobic crimes which targeted Muslims. Equally, in 2024, we've got a quote here from Nigel Farage, who has said then that we have a growing number of young people in this country who do not subscribe to British values, who in fact loathe much of what we stand for. And when he was asked, is that group that you're referring to young British Muslims, he replied in the affirmative. We've also then got some very similar quotes from Lee Anderson and Suella Braverman, but equally from Labour MPs as well. I haven't highlighted it on screen, but there was a particular remark made by Sarah Edwards, who is a Labour MP, and this was actually in Parliament, that an asylum hotel in her particular, in her particular constituency was used to house asylum seekers. And what we saw last year was that very same hotel was actually burned by mob uprisings throughout the course of obviously the summer. So we can see the impact then of the role of public figures, and it should not be underestimated. So we are now going to move on to Islamophobic narratives. So again, huge overlaps with what we have already sort of seen, what we touched upon, but I really want to sort of break down the narratives which are really pervasive and very dominant across UK and even on a European and an international level, so that we are all mindful of what these are, and then so that we as educators are actually prepared to combat these within the school community. before I actually go on to share the research paper, what I'm going to do is I'm going to share this video. And what I would like you to do is, as we're watching this video, is try to sort of identify some of the narratives which we can see as part of this particular video. Just a heads up that there is some foul and very offensive language and references in this particular video. So please just be mindful of that, and if at any sort of point that you need to sort of step aside, please do so. Hopefully this should play because I have shared with audio. If it doesn't, Neil, what I will do is I will share the link in the chat and then we can watch it individually. So we're just looking out for some Islamophobic narratives within this particular video or this particular incident.
Well, as you can see, this lot all coming out of fucking school, all these fucking here, so they're all going to have at least 4 to 5 fucking kids.
I can hear the video, but I can't see it being played.
You can't see it being played. What I will do, Neil, is I'll come out, I'll stop sharing, and I will share the link of the video so that you can watch that yourselves. Just bear with me one moment. Once you've finished watching the video, just either give me a sort of nod or a thumbs up, and then it will be really good to hear your sort of reflections on that. Okay, so I believe I've seen a few hands going up. So if we are ready to move on, we will do so. So I guess over to you to sort of share any sort of insights or any of your own sort of reflections from that particular incident that we saw. It did take place in 2019 and on the streets of London. But what sort of narratives were you able to sort of identify from that particular incident?
Yeah, I think, when again, just unbelievable that, this is out there and this is the view of somebody, when I say somebody, probably, unfortunately, a lot of people. And it's the fact that it was aimed at children. I can think that's something which kind of alarmed me, the most from it, is not just, it's just, it was, yeah, really, really not very nice.
Yeah, and in
Um,
particular, we can see here as well, obviously, young Muslim girls, and quite often there is a gendered impact of
I was,
Islamophobia. Those particularly women, visibly Muslim women, and even young girls who observe the hijab, we know that they are more likely to actually experience Islamophobia, and this is something that we as an organisation have actually identified as well. So we're actually conducting a nationwide survey on the nature of Islamophobia within schools. And what we have found really interestingly, and I guess it's a reflection of the sort of wider sort of context, is that the majority of responses have actually come from women or obviously young Muslim students. who identify as obviously women, and that is because there is very much this sort of gendered and this sort of connection to Muslim women who are very visible as a result of obviously their hijab or religious symbols. So really interesting then. There's something that you mentioned as well, Neil, that you identified yourself. Anything else? Any other sort of narratives before we sort of go on to explore these in a bit more detail?
Caroline just put in there, kind of obviously just highlighting how upsetting it is.
Absolutely. Okay, so thank you so much,
So
everyone.
can I ask you, kind of the person who was filming, was there charges brought against him, or
So
did
I
you know
believe he
that?
was arrested. Then I'm not entirely sure whether charges were actually brought, but I'm aware that the individual was arrested. That's something that I can look into. Um,
No, I was
I
just curious.
presume
Yeah,
so. Yeah,
you
out of
would hope, wouldn't
curiosity, but
you?
I presume so. He was most definitely arrested. But in terms of the outcome, I'm not entirely sure on that one, Neil. But we do often see as well. I mean, the evidence here is clearly very clear. But again, even from our survey that we have seen, similar sort of incidents in terms of the nature of it being verbal, charges are quite often dropped. In this particular incident, as I mentioned, they're not 100% certain, but the individual, they were arrested.
Okay, thank you.
So here then we have some Islamophobic narratives. I will focus specifically on a paper which was published by Professor Ian Law and others, which highlights 10 narratives which are pervasive across 8 European nations, including the UK. And I just wanted to sort of share my own sort of insights into this, which do not necessarily reflect the paper. So we see a common sort of misconception that all Muslims are Middle Eastern or Arab, and that is because Muslims are quite often seen as a homogenous group. But we know that Muslims are actually very diverse, not only in the way in which they practice their religion, in their appearance, but also from their ethnic and cultural background as well. Only 20% of the world's Muslim population actually originates from the Middle East. So evidently, overwhelmingly 80% comes outside of the Middle East or Arab sort of states. So here then we have the paper, as I mentioned, by Professor Ian Law, and we've got the 10 dominant narratives then which are pervasive across 8 European nations. And again, something that I would really, really urge all educators to be mindful of, because again, this is something that you will pick up in conversations, be they sort of everyday conversations, be that on online spaces, but also within the classroom. So we've got Islam and Muslims, they represent a threat to security. Islam and Muslims cannot be assimilated into the imagination. And again, we saw obviously connections to this in that video that we have just seen, but then also in the newspaper headlines and also the social media tweets that we saw on X. Islam and Muslims, they constitute a demographic threat. Quite often, there is this sort of misconception that the Muslim population in the UK is actually far higher than it actually is. Even when I speak with children and young people, we have a brief sort of exercise around the Muslim population in the UK, but also in the world. And quite often, even within the UK, I've heard numbers as high as 80%. And that is a reflection of obviously what we're seeing online and also within the media. Islam is based, on theocracy, and Muslims follow this blindly. Islam and Muslims, they pose a threat to the imagined national identity. Again, huge sort of overlaps between 2 and 5. Islam and Muslims, they promote and practice gender inequality. At number 7, we've got Islam and Muslims are essentially and inherently different to the national norm. Islam and Muslims are inherently violent, and this is where you often get that sort of association with Islam and terrorism. Islam and Muslims are incomplete citizens. And finally, then at number 10, we've got Islam and Muslims are inherently homophobic. And what's really, really interesting about this paper is that it actually forms a toolkit. And they do also provide counter narratives. Unfortunately, we just don't have time to kind of explore the counter narratives. But if you refer to that paper, they go through each of the European nations, and there's a specific report dedicated to the UK, and then alongside then that comes the counter narratives, which hopefully you can use within the classroom to counter any of these narratives should you actually come across them within the classroom. Before we move on to the pedagogy side of things, just want to briefly touch upon a legislative framework on what the law actually says about this and tackling the issue of Islamophobia. So we've got the Equality Act and the Public Sector Equality Duty, particularly obviously important for those schools which are maintained by the local authority, which is obviously the case for schools in Wales. Religion is one of the 9 protected characteristics under the Equality Act, and it's actually unlawful to discriminate on the grounds of religion or belief in employment and the provision of services. And equally, schools under the Public Sector Equality Duty, they actually need to have a due regard to eliminate discrimination, advance equality of opportunity, and to actually foster good relations between those who may be Muslim in this obviously scenario and those who may not. We've also got the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. Unaddressed and systematic Islamophobia potentially infringes the rights that we can see on screen. So we know that this is actually children's rights and human rights are actually at stake here. So we've got Article 2.2 non-discrimination. We've got the right of life, survival and development, but then also freedom of thought, conscience and religion. Equally for adults, but then also for children and young people as well, we've got the Human Rights Act and the ECHR, and of course the Human Rights Act actually incorporated the ECHR into domestic law here in the UK. So we've got the right to freedom of religion and belief, and that actually includes the right to hold beliefs and to manifest beliefs, and also the ECHR, the freedom of expression, freedom of thought, conscience and religion, and the right to an education. And equally, various other policies and practices, obviously, that you should be mindful of as educators. So we've got the EWC, obviously, Code of Practice and Conduct for Educators. We've got STIN inspectorate guidelines as well. Again, huge overlaps with a lot of what we have discussed, and other various sort of frameworks as well, which I'm sure will exist within obviously a sort of local council level as well. So that does bring us to an end to the first half. The rest of the session, it focuses then on a pedagogy for tackling Islamophobia. Neil, how do you sort of want to go about? Do you want to sort of incorporate a 5-minute break? I think it should take us around about another 15-20 minutes. Or equally, we can just kind of carry on and then have a earlier finish. It's completely up to you.
Well, first of all, Bisma, would you, because you've been the one who's doing the work today, so would you like a little break first of all? I think that's the important question. And if that's the case, then we're happy to. But if
I'm
not,
happy either or, honestly. I'm happy to kind of carry on if that's what everyone wants to. Or equally, if you just want a moment to sort of absorb everything that we've just shared during the first half, I'm happy for us to have a few minutes to break and then we can continue. Entirely up to you.
do people either kind of come in or just pop in the chat what they prefer? If there's no preference, then well, we'll just wait for the. Oh, can they go quick break? They go. Well, oh, if we do a quick break, then as we've had one, but just 5 minutes, we'll come back 11:25.
5 minutes, yes.
Is that okay?
Absolutely, yes. See you all shortly.
Thank you.
Okay, so it is 25 past, so we will make a start kneel if everyone is back and ready
Yeah.
to move on to the second half of the session. So just to sort of flag here, if you have the opportunity, so if you haven't, I'll make sure to signpost you to this towards the end as well. But we do have a bunch of free teaching and learning resources that you can use. As part of this segment anyway, I will signpost you to all of the wonderful resources that we have and that you can use within your own settings. So without further ado, we will now move on to the second half of today's professional learning session, which is specifically centered around tackling Islamophobia through the formal school level curriculum, but then also the hidden curriculum. And again, there's various sort of legislation and policies which actually warrant the attention of educators to tackle Islamophobia. And of course, we touched upon those just before we took that short break. Equally, we've got the Wales's commitment to obviously becoming an anti-racist nation and the Anti-Racist Wales Action Plan. And again, huge overlaps with the work that we're doing here at EAI. And we do fundamentally believe that our work actually complements this work. And we've got a various sort of range of resources and other sort of teaching, learning sort of materials that you can use within your respective settings. So we'll start off first and foremost then with the pedagogy side of things and thinking about how we can actually address Islamophobia through the formal school level curriculum. So we've got wonderful contributions here from an individual named Hussein, who has argued then to help eradicate Islamophobia specifically through the classroom and the curriculum. Teachers actually must provide students with a better understanding of Islam and Muslims, and that can actually be achieved through the following approaches that he's highlighted. So these include the concept of contributions, the concept of diversity. So as we've mentioned, Muslims are not a homogenous group. There is huge diversity amongst obviously Muslims and across the globe. So really highlighting those. In terms of contributions, there's a plethora of examples that you can use, not just obviously in recent times, but throughout the course of history, which really highlight the contributions of Muslims to world civilization. We've got this idea or this concept of similarities, and in particular, similarities between the main sort of Abrahamic religions. And this is a perfect opportunity as well for primary school educators, something that obviously you'd be covering anyway. Thinking about how you can specifically weave in then Islamophobia awareness through this idea of similarities and differences, and again something that we do through our own teaching and learning materials at the early years level. And then we've also then perhaps for more of our mature students in secondary schools and even key stage sort of two, the concept of historical roots of Muslims in the UK. We've also then got another contribution here from Khan, who really argues then that in order to tackle Islamophobia within the sort of classroom and the school environment, a decolonial pedagogical approach is actually imperative. This will enable schools and educators to actually foster critical thinking, but then also inclusive classroom environments. And there are two key takeaways that I've highlighted from this particular paper. So we've got then that today's learners should be equipped to deconstruct the Orientalist depictions about sociocultural roots of Islamophobia. The sort of term Orientalism can be credited to an author named Edward Said, and essentially it is a lens through which Europe and the West actually views the East. The Orient itself is actually depicted as exotic, backwards, irrational, uncivilized, and quite often it is actually a deliberate tool which has been used to dominate and control the East. And again, if you're interested in learning more about that, Edward Said's text Orientalism is a really good read, which will hopefully give you a better understanding of that particular term and how it can actually be applied to our classroom environments. Equally, then, another takeaway that I've highlighted is the importance of literature, and especially for our younger readers as well, that will enable then children, young people to develop empathy, but then also enhancing critical thinking skills. And this is really, really important, particularly for schools to have diverse literature, and not just for those sort of students who see themselves perhaps represented in literature, but then also obviously for those who form part of the global majority, who do not always see themselves represented in literature. And this always takes me back to Rudine Sims Bishop's notion of children's literature acting as windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors, and the importance and the need for having diverse literature, not just for those children who form part of the global majority, and as I've already mentioned, who may not necessarily see themselves represented in books, but equally for those students who have always seen themselves represented in books because they actually need windows onto reality and to realise and to acknowledge the diverse nature of the world that they're living in. And quite often, as well as an organisation, when we sort of approach schools, there's quite often there's this sort of resistance, especially from schools which are not particularly diverse and that do not have a diverse demographic. And they sort of state that there's not a necessity for this, but in some respects, those schools are actually more in need of our work on these interventions than those that may have sort of a diverse makeup. And that classic sort of example of Rudine Sims Bishop sort of view or her sort of argument around having that sort of diverse literature can equally be applied to what I have just shared there. Thinking specifically again around Khan, if we just focus on his piece of paper before we move on to the next one, Khan also then provides a pedagogical framework, which again we can apply to our classrooms. So he argues then that a sort of pedagogical framework which will enable educators to really raise an awareness of Islamophobia and to really debunk myths around Islam and Muslims are centered around the four sort of ideas that you can see on screen now. So foregrounding multifaceted Muslim perspectives, again, huge links to what we've already seen in the sense that Muslims are quite often viewed as a homogenous group. So really sort of emphasising the diversity even amongst obviously the Muslim community. Contextualizing historical representation, so thinking about obviously the history of Muslims here within sort of the UK, but then also thinking about where do those sort of power relations come from, why does essentially Islamophobia and racism exist in the very first place, and tracing the sort of roots and the origins then of those depictions. We've also then got developing critical literacy skills, ensuring that students actually have opportunities to have conversations and to actually deconstruct particular narratives. So that is focused on number 4. And then again, making sure then that we give students and the opportunity to actually apply what they're absorbing or what they're learning in the classroom and apply it to everyday context. And that is sort of highlighted as well within the curriculum for Wales and ensuring that students are actually provided with authentic context for learning. So equally everything that we sort of share with our students, thinking about how we can actually apply that to every sort of day practice and the realities then that students may face. And then there's a practical implementation here, so around curriculum integration. So not to sort of shoehorn this in around particular sort of awareness days throughout during the course of the academic year. Quite often what we see is schools kind of, obviously with the best intentions, they have like drop down days, but quite often that can do more harm than good. So thinking about how you can actually weave and integrate this throughout the course of obviously the curriculum in a cross-curricular format. We've also got then a really, really interesting contribution here from Abdullah Najjar, a very recent paper, who draws upon Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed, which essentially highlights education as a tool for liberation. So in this respect, Islamophobia awareness education can actually be seen as a form of inclusive critical pedagogy that actually seeks to amplify the voice of Muslims who, I guess in this sense, would be seen as the voiceless, and to actually create safe spaces for students to express their perspectives and experiences. Obviously, I know within Bridgend, not particularly diverse in the sense of the Muslim sort of community, if I'm not mistaken. There are around about 750 Muslims in Bridgend, but equally what we could look to do is using, again, literature, highlighting stories of Muslim communities, and then applying that sort of analysis to what we are seeing through text and providing students with that opportunity to break down barriers. Equally, for those schools that may actually have a demographic, what this particular paper emphasizes again is not to sort of alienate or to kind of put a spotlight even on Muslim students, because quite often again that can do more harm than good. So again, using literature as a really powerful sort of medium and a tool to highlight sort of narratives and different perspectives and to really facilitate those conversations around Islam and Islamophobia. Here we've got a really interesting point around content integration. And on the next slide, I've got an example of what this actually looks like in practice. But really important, and again, I've touched upon this, is to actually weave this in throughout the curriculum in a sort of holistic way. And what this essentially does then is that Muslims and Islams will not be introduced as the other, and that is something that we quite often see with schools across the UK, but they'll be included in a cross-curriculum format alongside other cultures. And again, as I've already mentioned, that would reduce the likelihood of placing Muslim students in a unwanted spotlight. So what does this actually look like in practice then? So here then we've got an example of a nutrition lesson, so exploring dietary requirements, so not specifically on the halal diet, and it's actually really interesting is that we don't actually have to teach about dietary requirements for Muslims through RVE. It can be done through other sort of lenses and other subject areas. So for nutrition, if we have a specific lesson around exploring dietary requirements, and here we can cover allergies, health conditions, religion, and also beliefs. And there's an activity here that I've highlighted then, or an activity suggestion. So preparing a meal for the following athletes. So Amar is a swimmer from India. He's a Hindu. He doesn't eat any meats and hates avocados. Sarah is a sprinter from England. She's allergic to nuts. She's also Jewish and therefore only eats kosher food. And then Mustafa then is a gymnast from Nigeria who's Muslim and only eats halal food. So again, here you can see that rather than actually isolating our Muslims, we kind of putting them, we're reducing that sort of likelihood of putting Muslim students, irrespective of the fact that if we do have Muslim students in our classroom, and putting that sort of unwanted spotlight, and we can look to see how this actually fits in with sort of wider lesson plans and curriculum planning around dietary requirements. And I just wanted to finish off specifically on the curriculum around how this actually links to the curriculum for Wales. So the teaching of Black, Asian and minority ethnic histories and experiences is actually mandatory as part of the curriculum for Wales. So it's actually a perfect opportunity for us to actually integrate the histories of Muslims and Muslim communities within Wales through our curriculum. When we think about this idea of Cynefin, so exploring the multicultural history of our locality and Wales, Cardiff University actually have produced a wonderful exhibition on the history of Islam in Wales. I was actually at the Senedd yesterday and they had this exhibition there. So please do make use of that. I believe it is available as a digital format as well, and it really highlights then the history of Islam and Muslims within Wales and a wonderful resource for schools. We've also then got the cross-cutting themes of human rights and diversity. So again, I've kind of extracted this specific directly from the Curriculum for Wales's website, but you can see various sort of angles through which we can come through, including the idea of similarities and differences, developing an understanding of different faiths and beliefs, and equally really important that there is a specific link to challenging stereotypes, and a huge component of Islamophobia awareness education is challenging the stereotypes because we know that they are incredibly rife across society. So what we are now going to do is focus on the hidden curriculum, and I've got two really powerful quotes here which really highlight the power of the hidden curriculum, because quite often again as an organisation we're faced with questions from perhaps educators who may come outside of the traditional sort of areas or the faculties or the areas of learning and experience, which are often viewed as sort of best placed to tackle anti-racism and Islamophobia awareness. But equally important is the hidden curriculum. And you can see here that real change will only be achieved when the hidden curriculum that conveys strong messages to our young people about their place in society is also addressed and aligned to our values. And a wonderful way that we can do that through to achieve that is through inclusive practice. So here we've got the example then of nursery and everyday school life. So allowing Muslim students to celebrate Eid if there is obviously a Muslim sort of body and a staff force, allowing for prayer times, and that will enable obviously students to sort of normalize such practices and make Muslims feel like a respected part of the nursery or school community. Equally, for policies and practices, then we've got various different policies that we can sort of highlight this within, including diversity and inclusion, anti-bullying, race equality and curriculum, making sure that students and staff are aware of these policies, and equally prioritising then curriculum change in school development planning and school improvement planning. We've also then got assemblies and campaigns, so ensuring then that assemblies address the themes of diversity and tolerance, conveying messages of harmony, cooperation and community spirit. November is always a wonderful month through which we can actually tackle the issue of Islamophobia, and quite often it serves as a platform for those schools who are sort of new to tackling the issue. So November, not only is it Islamophobia Awareness Month, so that is a month-long campaign which takes place every November, which aims to raise an awareness of Islamophobia but also highlighting the positive contributions of Muslims. We've also got Anti-Bullying Week, so we can actually raise awareness of Muslims as obviously victims of bullying. But then equally, we've got Remembrance Sunday, and I always urge schools to really highlight then the contributions of the Muslims and the Muslim Commonwealth to obviously the war effort, to both the First and Second World Wars, and something that is quite often overlooked in our history lessons and when we commemorate Remembrance Sunday. We've also got school ethos, ensuring that our sort of vision and our ethos and our values, they emphasise values such as tolerance and equality. School library, what does our literature look like? Does it reflect diversity? Who are the authors? Who are the main characters? Can non-sort of Muslims see themselves represented in the literature that we see? But equally then for those students who are not Muslims, do they have access then to diverse literature? We've also then got classroom displays, which are incredibly important, thinking about how we can sort of raise an awareness of Muslim individuals, and celebrating diversity and promoting awareness. And then we've also got then staff, thinking about what our staff force looks like, but then equally then Islamophobia awareness training, incredibly important as a first sort of step to tackling this issue on a wider school level. That does bring me to an end to everything that I wanted to cover. I do just want to highlight some of our resources that you can take away and apply within your respective settings. So I'll start off with the early years and our sort of baseline introductory materials that we urge schools across the UK to adopt as part of their curriculums. And these are actually rooted then in the national curriculum frameworks for England, Scotland and Wales. So at the early years level, and I know obviously the language and the terminology has changed in Wales, but at the early sort of foundation phase or the foundation sort of level, we've got our storybook Amna and Amy, which is centered around the protagonist, visibly looking character Amna, who is worried about her first day at nursery, and her sort of worries and anxieties are centered around the fact that she feels that there'll be no one in her sort of class who is of a similar background to her. But as the story unfolds, we actually learn that Amna has far more in common than differences with her classmates. And the storybook is available in both digital and physical formats. Digital copy is available for you to access free of charge online. Physical copies we can send across, but there is a small sort of fee attached to that just so that we can cover printing costs. The book itself as well has actually been listed in libraries across the UK. There are currently 113 books in circulation, and in Wales, Denbighshire libraries, Cardiff libraries and Newport libraries have actually catalogued the books. Hopefully we can get it listed within Bridgend as well.
I was going to say, Bismillah, I'll look into that as well, see if we can link
Yes,
you with the
please,
library
Neil.
service.
That will be great, thank you. In conjunction with the earlier storybook, we've also got 2 supporting lesson plans which educators can use to really sort of raise an awareness of the sort of Muslim sort of identity and the culture, but then also really thinking about this idea of similarities and differences. They are fully resourced, they come with step-by-step lesson plans, and the accompany sort of resources and PowerPoints and worksheets that you need. Equally, if you need any support in sort of applying this directly within your settings, please do get in touch. But everything that you need is there, it's available to access online. At the primary school level, for Key Stage sort of 1, Key Stage 2, we've got a unit of work which consists of 6 lesson plans. Again, fully resourced, comes with step-by-step lesson plans and guidance documents. Just a flag, at the primary school in the sort of foundation phase level, we don't actually address the term Islamophobia, but we aim to tackle it through other themes and lenses. So for example, similarities and differences, anti-bullying and children's rights. At the secondary school level, we've got a distinct unit of work, which again consists of 6 lesson plans, but at this level, we do introduce students to the term Islamophobia. We explore it in quite a lot of detail, but again, even at this level, we aim to sort of touch upon other themes and lenses. So you can see the very first lesson on screen for secondary school students is centered around how does the law protect Ali from religious discrimination. So very much touching upon children's and human rights. But then equally at this stage, then we touch upon or we cover, I think it's the final lesson, media and digital literacy. So please do access these, the wonderful resources which have been used by schools across the UK. And then we also have then resources for educators. So we've got our Islamophobia Awareness CPD, which is available online, albeit the sort of older version, but again, nevertheless available for you to access. It comes with a crib sheet, and the wonderful news is that it is actually available in Welsh as well. So please do share it far and wide. And then we also then, for educators specifically, have an EDI audit for senior leaders and governors. And again, you can see some of the main aims and outputs of these particular resources. And then finally, I just wanted to touch upon, because we've got so many resources, unfortunately, I won't be able to talk you through them all, but a resource that we published earlier this summer with the National Education Union, specifically for primary schools, but equally a wonderful resource that secondary school educators and schools can use for inspiration. But the resource is then the Magnifying Magnificent Muslims Toolkit. So in collaboration with the NU, we published this toolkit earlier this year to support primary school educators and facilitate conversations around Islamophobia, but in particular Muslim contributions across the curriculum. So I've got a snapshot here, for example, from the maths sort of subject area, or the area of learning and experience here, and how this would look like in practice for primary school educators. For secondary school educators, again, I've got inspiration that I've derived specifically from the toolkit itself that we have devised and what this actually looks like in practice. So again, we can sort of use obviously what we have from the primary school toolkit and develop that then for secondary school level, and specifically thinking about the origins of algebra and the contributions then of individuals such as Muhammad al-Khwarizmi, who actually introduced the numeral system that we're using today in Europe, and concepts such as algebra and algorithms to the field of mathematics. But sadly, his contributions are often overlooked. So please do check out that resource. That is specifically available to download through the NU's website, but again, a wonderful resource that you can use free of charge. And then finally, I just wanted to signpost then to our Islamophobia in School survey. We want to hear from a range of different settings across the UK and even within Wales. So irrespective of your demographics, if you have actually witnessed Islamophobia within school, please do share your experience. It's not just for those who have experienced Islamophobia, but for students and educators and parents and carers who have actually witnessed Islamophobia within a school setting. So there's a QR code there. It will lead you directly to the survey. If you're interested in learning more about the survey, if you head over to our website, there'll be further information there. Just wanted to flag one of the responses that we received from a London-based student. So you can see here then that when I was in school, I had a teacher who was openly racist and Islamophobic. Every time I spoke or tried to participate, he ignored me or made sarcastic remarks about my faith. It was humiliating and I felt powerless in the classroom. But equally, this particular response instills a sense of hope, particularly for educators and the power of education, and equally our work at EAI. So you can see here then that one day we had a project on world cultures. I presented about Islamic traditions, sharing what they really meant. The class went silent, and for the first time he had no words to dismiss me. I realised then that even when people are full of prejudice, showing knowledge and staying true to yourself can make them think twice. So as we've already discussed, and obviously the purpose of obviously today's session was really to emphasise the power that we have as educators and also the power of education to counter obviously harmful narratives, and a clear example of which we can see on screen. So please, please, please do make use of the resources. If you need any further support, be that from a sort of workshop capacity or even help with actually implementing the materials, please don't hesitate to get in touch. We're here and we would love to support. And then one final thing I promise before we do wrap things up is a QR code for a feedback survey. So please do share your feedback. This will then be shared with the ASDA Foundation, completely anonymous. Even though we do ask for emails, we won't sort of, if you don't want to attribute your sort of name, we won't necessarily do that. But please do share your feedback. It will help us sort of improve future sessions as well, and then hopefully something that we can use as testimonials as well to share with schools across the UK. Thank you ever so much, everyone. I hope it's been informative. I hope there's lots for you to take away and to apply to your settings. And thank you ever so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Pisma. Thank you. It's kind of, I think that the slide before you just showed there, the reflection from that learner is so impactful, and that, unfortunately, even within education, potentially there's kind of those views, but there's hope as well, isn't there? I suppose from that perspective as well. And the, kind of the resources that are available look fantastic. And I will ask if there's any other questions, but from our perspective, from within Bridgend, just wondering, first of all, if schools, this funding that you through the ASDA Foundation is coming to the end now in November, but if schools wanted to engage with yourselves, either through kind of a bespoke support, or kind of more professional learning, is there first of all that capacity? Because I know I've spoken to you previously about that you kind of being a small team, and obviously is there a cost and attributed to those things?
Absolutely, yeah. So we'd love to support. So please do reach out if you do require that support. And I think the wonderful thing is that I am based in South Wales. So even if it is, for example, face-to-face sort of CPD or workshops that you require, please do get in touch. We are a charity, so there's only obviously so much that we can offer complimentary for schools, but we're always looking out for funding. And if there are any sort of future opportunities through which we can dedicate sort of workshops or CPD for schools specifically, I will make sure to sort of signpost Neil to that so that he can signpost you. But equally, we will see what we can do, nevertheless, to support you. As I've mentioned, we could equally do that online as well. Our workshops for pupils, they do come, we do charge £80 per workshop. But as I mentioned, what we are doing as an organisation is we're always looking at for small pots of funding, such as through which we've offered these particular workshops, and hopefully we can offer something complimentary, because we appreciate as an organisation as well, especially for schools that are maintained by the local authority, funding can often be an issue, so we would love to support. So I will sort of stay in touch, and if there are any further opportunities, but nevertheless we're available throughout the course of the year to offer support in any way, shape or form.
Fantastic, thank you very much. Are there any other questions before we leave the workshop? Can see, just to kind of clarify this, and thanks within the chat comment. I know it's me unable to see it with the presentation, so just to kind of read it again, thank you for your time for today. Thank you for the teachers attending as well, and to say I hope you enjoy the rest of your day and have a good weekend. I'll stop recording for now. I'll find it.
Thanks everyone, take care.
Thank you. Looking for where you stop more. There you go.